The first indication of danger did not come from an alarm panel or a command channel. It came from a child's screams echoing inside a wing designed to remain silent and sealed at all times. Movement sensors activated where access was strictly prohibited, while response windows began narrowing by the second. What the systems were detecting should not have been possible. Within moments, the situation escalated beyond routine control, leaving authority with a single option as time worked against safety. The restricted wing had been designed to operate in a state of controlled silence. Its corridors were insulated to prevent sound transfer, its access points reinforced by layered authorization, and its monitoring systems calibrated to detect even the slightest irregularity. When the first acoustic anomaly registered, it immediately disrupted that balance. The system did not classify the signal as mechanical interference or environmental noise. It identified it as a human distress pattern originating from a zone where no human presence was permitted. Within seconds, the alert propagated across internal monitoring channels. Motion sensors activated sequentially, confirming movement where access logs showed no authorization. These systems were built to cross-verify each other automatically. If one triggered, the others were expected to validate it. In this case, they did, but the result was deeply troubling. Every confirmation reinforced the same conclusion: a breach was actively unfolding. The acoustic data refined itself rapidly. Frequency analysis indicated repeated high-intensity vocalization consistent with a child in distress. This classification was not subjective. The system relied on pre-established profiles used specifically to differentiate between ambient sounds and human emergencies. The presence of a child inside the restricted wing immediately elevated the situation beyond standard security concern. Access logs were retrieved and analyzed in parallel. Doors that required dual authorization had recorded recent activity, yet the corresponding clearance entries were either incomplete or absent entirely. This discrepancy suggested that safeguards had not failed passively, they had been circumvented. That realization marked the first clear escalation from anomaly to violation. At this stage, uncertainty narrowed. The issue was no longer whether the alert was valid, but how such a breach could occur within a structure built to prevent it. The wing's isolation, once considered its greatest strength, now limited visibility. Camera coverage was intentionally minimal to protect sensitive operations, creating blind zones that made real-time assessment difficult. The risk sharpened as the child's distress continued. Each detected sound confirmed persistence rather than a fleeting event. The system updated its threat assessment accordingly, reclassifying the situation as ongoing exposure to harm. This change triggered higher-level notifications and reduced the margin for procedural delay. A brief pause followed as internal teams validated system integrity. Diagnostic checks confirmed that sensors, logs, and alerts were functioning correctly. There was no technical malfunction to explain away the data. What the systems reported was real. That clarity intensified urgency. The restricted wing had not merely been compromised, it now contained a vulnerable individual without oversight, visibility, or protection. Every second without physical confirmation increased the potential for irreversible harm. The Royal Guard was notified at the moment the severity threshold was crossed. This notification was not routine escalation. It represented acknowledgement that internal safeguards alone could no longer manage the risk. Authority beyond standard procedural control was required. The situation had reached a point where monitoring was insufficient. Observation without intervention was no longer neutral. It was actively dangerous.
As confirmation reached senior oversight, the implications became impossible to ignore. The restricted wing operated under absolute rules, no unauthorized access and no exceptions. The child's continued presence violated those rules at multiple levels simultaneously. Each detected scream reinforced that the breach was not static, but unfolding in real time. Initial containment options were reviewed rapidly. Electronic lockdowns were considered, but sealing access points without knowing the child's precise location introduced significant risk. Environmental controls were assessed to ensure that automated systems would not exacerbate conditions inside the wing. These checks were necessary, but they consumed time the situation could not afford. A critical vulnerability emerged during this phase. Existing protocols assumed compliance before breach. They were designed to prevent unauthorized entry, not to respond when prevention failed. This assumption created friction. Procedures demanded validation, consensus, and documentation, even as the threat escalated. Motion indicators revealed erratic patterns, suggesting movement under stress rather than controlled transit. This detail altered risk assessment significantly. It implied that the child was not stationary and that conditions inside the wing were unstable. Without visual confirmation, every mitigation strategy carried uncertainty. Alert acknowledgement timelines were reviewed next. Several response windows had been missed or delayed, indicating hesitation within supervisory layers. Whether this hesitation stemmed from confusion or procedural caution was irrelevant. The effect was the same. Valuable minutes were lost. This delay represented a secondary escalation. The breach itself was dangerous, but the system's slow response amplified that danger. Authority remained fragmented, distributed across multiple decision points rather than centralized where it could act decisively. The Royal Guard's mandate allowed intervention when systemic failure endangered protected individuals. That threshold was now clearly met. Preparations began to transition authority from observation to action. Entry points were identified and prioritized based on proximity and structural integrity. The objective was controlled access, not indiscriminate force. A brief moment of heightened tension followed when audio sensors detected a sudden spike in intensity. The screams rose sharply before cutting off. That abrupt change forced immediate reassessment. Silence did not indicate safety, it indicated uncertainty. The risk profile escalated again. This moment resolved quickly as movement sensors reactivated, confirming continued presence inside the wing. The immediate danger had not passed, it had shifted. Command authorization was issued to prepare for forced entry if conditions failed to stabilize. This authorization marked the end of procedural debate. Authority acknowledged that protection now outweighed protocol adherence. The incident phase concluded with a clear operational understanding. The safeguards designed to prevent such a breach had failed. Observation had reached its limit. What followed would determine whether control could be restored before the situation deteriorated further.
Escalation began the moment the initial alert failed to trigger a unified response. The security systems had already confirmed a child's screams inside a restricted wing, yet authority fractured instead of consolidating. Separate monitoring units reviewed the same data through different interfaces, each confirming fragments of the threat without forming a single operational picture. Motion sensors showed irregular movement. Audio feeds confirmed distress. Access logs showed no authorized entry. The contradictions slowed action at the precise moment urgency demanded it. As internal channels filled with parallel assessments, response windows narrowed. Supervisors hesitated, waiting for confirmation that never fully arrived.
The safeguards in place were designed to prevent unauthorized access, not to manage ambiguity after a breach had already occurred. This limitation became immediately apparent. The system could detect danger, but it could not compel decisive action without human authority stepping in. The situation shifted as the screams continued. Environmental sensors registered movement deeper within the restricted wing, indicating that the child was not stationary. This observable change transformed the threat profile. What might have been a brief intrusion now showed signs of persistence. The risk expanded with each new data point, yet containment strategies remained theoretical without physical confirmation. A brief attempt was made to stabilize the situation remotely. Electronic barriers were reinforced, and internal access points were placed on heightened restriction. These actions created the appearance of control, but introduced new danger. Locking systems without knowing the child's exact location risked isolating them from assistance. The escalation was no longer confined to the breach itself, but extended to the consequences of misapplied safeguards. At this stage, time pressure intensified abruptly. Audio indicators spiked again, triggering a higher alert threshold. For several seconds, system feedback lagged as data streams recalibrated. That delay exposed a critical vulnerability. The systems were reactive, not predictive, and every recalibration cost time that could not be recovered. The risk was simple and immediate. A child remained inside a space never designed to accommodate vulnerability. Every layer meant to prevent such exposure had failed, and hesitation compounded the danger. What began as a procedural discrepancy had now evolved into an unfolding emergency. Escalation accelerated when access logs revealed additional anomalies. Doors that required layered authorization showed activity without corresponding clearance records. This was no longer a question of delayed response alone. It suggested that safeguards had been bypassed deliberately or through severe negligence. Either explanation widened the scope of risk. The situation demanded authority capable of overriding process. Yet authority remained distributed, diffused across departments operating in parallel rather than sequence. Each moment of delay allowed the breach to deepen, shifting escalation from technical failure to systemic breakdown. As escalation continued, internal communications grew more urgent but no more decisive. Departments acknowledged the danger independently, yet no single command structure asserted control. The absence of centralized authority became the defining factor of this phase. Every safeguard assumed compliance. Once that assumption failed, the system struggled to adapt. The restricted wing's design intensified the problem. Its isolation reduced visual oversight and limited the effectiveness of remote monitoring. Environmental readings showed fluctuations consistent with movement, but still offered no confirmation of the child's condition. This uncertainty magnified risk. Each attempted solution carried the potential to worsen the situation rather than resolve it. A sharp increase in urgency occurred when internal alerts flagged missed acknowledgement windows. Automated escalation protocols required confirmation from multiple nodes, and those confirmations lagged. The system treated the event as an anomaly rather than an emergency, allowing critical time to pass. This visible delay marked a turning point. Escalation was no longer gradual, it was accelerating. The child's safety overtook all procedural considerations. The absence of immediate harm could no longer be assumed. Prolonged exposure to an uncontrolled environment introduced unpredictable variables, from physical injury to system-triggered hazards. The possibility that the breach involved intentional action further increased the stakes. For a brief moment, containment simulations were run to assess outcomes without physical entry. Each simulation produced the same result. Electronic lockdowns risked isolating the child. Continued monitoring without intervention risked escalation beyond control. The simulations themselves became evidence of failure, demonstrating that standard measures could not resolve the threat. This realization created a sudden spike in tension. The system had reached its operational limit. Authority could no longer be deferred to process or consensus. The escalation phase had exposed a fundamental truth. Detection without enforcement was insufficient when vulnerability was present. The environment crossed a clear threshold. What remained was not uncertainty, but consequence. Every indicator pointed toward immediate danger if the situation persisted. With time now working against safety, escalation reached its final stage. The next decision would determine whether control could be restored before irreversible harm occurred. The conditions now demanded decisive authority. The breach had evolved beyond procedural management into a full-scale emergency. Escalation had done its work, revealing the cost of hesitation. What followed would no longer be dictated by system limitations, but by the willingness of authority to act. The shift toward evidence collection marked a critical change in how the situation was being handled. Until this point, responses had been driven by live indicators and escalating risk. Now the focus turned to understanding how a breach of this magnitude had occurred in a space designed to prevent precisely such an event. The Royal Guard directed all analytical resources toward reconstructing the sequence that allowed unauthorized presence inside the restricted wing. CCTV systems were isolated first. Every camera linked to the wing's perimeter and internal corridors was synchronized to a single timeline. This process immediately exposed inconsistencies. Areas expected to remain static showed brief intervals of movement, not aligned with any approved access route. These movements were subtle but undeniable, appearing in zones where clearance requirements were among the strictest. The risk sharpened when footage revealed doors opening without corresponding authorization logs. The systems registered compliance where none should have existed. This was not a simple lag in data processing. The timestamps aligned too closely, suggesting the safeguards had been deliberately bypassed rather than accidentally overridden. Each frame added weight to the conclusion that the breach was active and intentional. At this stage, time pressure increased abruptly. New alerts flagged additional motion deeper within the wing, indicating that the situation was not contained. The Royal Guard responded by narrowing the analytical scope, prioritizing live risk over historical review. This decision ensured that evidence gathering did not delay protective action. The immediate danger remained unchanged. A child was still inside a restricted environment, and the mechanisms meant to prevent that reality had failed. The evidence was no longer abstract. It was shaping decisions in real time. Access logs were brought into the analysis next. These records were expected to provide clarity, yet they introduced further concern. Entries appeared fragmented, as though attempts had been made to disrupt the normal sequence of authorization. Credentials were accepted at moments that fell outside permitted schedules. In several cases, required secondary confirmations were missing entirely. This created a visible escalation. What had begun as a breach now showed signs of systematic exploitation. The Royal Guard identified that multiple layers of protection had been compromised, not through a single failure, but through a chain of vulnerabilities. Each vulnerability increased exposure, compounding risk with every passing minute. To prevent cognitive overload among response teams, the Guard consolidated findings into a simplified operational picture. The situation was restated clearly. Safeguards were bypassed, alerts were delayed, and the breach remained unresolved. The child's continued presence elevated every system failure into a direct threat. As analysts worked, another micro-tension point emerged. Surveillance blind spots appeared in positions that reduced oversight during critical moments. These gaps were brief but strategically placed. The likelihood of coincidence diminished rapidly. The integrity of the monitoring infrastructure itself was now in question. The Royal Guard adjusted posture accordingly. Evidence was no longer being collected solely to explain the breach. It was now being used to justify immediate decisive authority. The proof established that automated systems alone could not resolve the crisis. Control would require intervention beyond observation. By the end of this phase, the evidence had reached a threshold. It demonstrated not only how the breach occurred, but why hesitation could no longer be tolerated. The safeguards had spoken. Authority needed to act. With initial findings confirmed, the Royal Guard expanded verification through secondary systems. Manual cross-checks replaced automated assumptions, ensuring that no anomaly went unexamined. This deeper review revealed patterns that reinforced the severity of the breach. Temporary system overrides, intended for rare and controlled use, had been activated repeatedly without proper documentation. Each activation represented a moment where safety had been subordinated to access. The repetition of this behavior indicated intent or gross negligence, both of which carried serious implications. As this information surfaced, risk levels spiked again. Environmental sensors within the wing registered sustained movement, consistent with prolonged presence rather than a brief intrusion. This confirmed that the breach was ongoing. The child's exposure was not limited to a single moment, but extended across a period of vulnerability. To reset focus and prevent analytical paralysis, the Guard summarized the situation in operational terms. The breach was deliberate or enabled. The safeguards had failed to enforce restrictions, and the risk remained active. This clarity sharpened decision-making and prevented distraction by technical detail. Communication records were examined next. Internal messages showed fragmented reporting and delayed escalation. Responsibility appeared diffused, with multiple teams assuming intervention would occur elsewhere. This diffusion of authority explained why alerts, though detected, did not translate to immediate action. Another moment of micro-tension emerged when analysts discovered that certain alerts had been rerouted away from command channels. Whether through misconfiguration or deliberate action, this diversion had cost critical response time. This realization introduced urgency that cut through remaining hesitation. The Royal Guard treated this discovery as a decisive factor. Evidence now showed that the system did not merely fail under pressure, it was actively undermined. This distinction mattered. It meant that restoration of safety required more than technical correction. It required reassertion of authority capable of overriding compromised processes. At this point, evidence collection reached its functional limit. Additional analysis would not change the risk profile. The breach was verified, the exposure was confirmed, and the child's safety could not be guaranteed without physical intervention. To maintain momentum, the Guard consolidated all findings into a single operational mandate. The evidence justified immediate escalation beyond standard response. The purpose of continued review was no longer explanatory, but corrective. The final verification step aligned live sensor data with historical logs, confirming continuity between the breach and current risk indicators. There was no separation between past failure and present danger. The situation was unfolding, not concluded. With this confirmation, evidence fulfilled its role. It removed ambiguity, eliminated debate, and transformed uncertainty into obligation. The Royal Guard now held verified proof that inaction would extend harm. The transition from analysis to decisive action was no longer a matter of choice, but of responsibility.
The decision to force entry marked a definitive shift in authority. Until that moment, every response had been constrained by layers of procedure designed to prevent overreach. Those constraints dissolved when it became clear that existing controls were no longer capable of protecting the child inside the restricted wing. Audio indicators continued to register distress, and movement sensors showed irregular patterns that suggested the situation was actively changing, not stabilizing. The longer the wing remained sealed, the more dangerous inaction became. Command authority was centralized without delay. Oversight responsibilities that had previously been distributed across multiple departments were suspended, and a single operational directive was issued under the Royal Guard's mandate. This consolidation immediately altered the tempo of the response. Decisions that once required confirmation now moved forward decisively. The restricted wing was reclassified from a controlled environment to an active risk zone, triggering protocols reserved for critical intervention. Entry planning began with rapid assessment of the wing's physical structure. Primary access points were identified, along with secondary routes that could be used if initial entry was obstructed. Structural barriers designed to resist intrusion now presented a challenge to timely access. Each barrier represented both protection and delay, and the balance between them had to be recalibrated in real time. A brief spike in sensor activity raised immediate concern. Movement indicators clustered near an interior corridor, suggesting relocation rather than stationary distress. This sudden change intensified urgency. The risk profile shifted from uncertainty to immediacy, reinforcing the necessity of forced entry. Waiting for conditions to stabilize was no longer viable. A short operational pause followed, not for hesitation, but for alignment. The situation was restated in its simplest terms. A child was inside a restricted wing, safeguards had failed, and time was now a liability. This reset ensured that every unit involved was operating under the same understanding of risk before action resumed. Manual override procedures were authorized. Electronic locks that normally required layered authentication were disengaged under direct command approval. Each override was logged automatically, creating a record that acknowledged the breach of protocol while prioritizing protection. The act of overriding safeguards underscored the seriousness of the moment. Protocol was not being ignored, it was being consciously set aside because it no longer served safety. Teams moved into position with defined boundaries. Speed was essential, but uncontrolled entry risked introducing new hazards. Movement was coordinated to preserve situational awareness as barriers were cleared in sequence. Environmental readings were monitored continuously, allowing adjustments to be made as new data emerged. As the first access point was breached, conditions inside the wing became partially visible. Sensor feedback shifted from predictive to confirmatory, reducing uncertainty. The forced entry was no longer theoretical, it had begun, and with it, authority reclaimed control over a space that had momentarily escaped it. Once inside the restricted wing, the Royal Guard transitioned immediately from entry to containment. The environment was no longer treated as sealed, but as an active zone requiring stabilization. Movement paths were secured, and internal checkpoints were established to control flow and prevent further unauthorized activity. Each adjustment reduced unpredictability and restored operational clarity. Portable monitoring equipment expanded visibility beyond the wing's fixed systems. Areas previously obscured by design were now brought under direct observation. This shift transformed sensor data into actionable confirmation. Where uncertainty had dominated earlier phases, verified conditions now guided decisions. A brief surge in environmental fluctuation prompted immediate reassessment. Temperature and motion indicators spiked near an interior junction, suggesting recent movement. The moment passed quickly as containment measures tightened, but it reinforced the importance of maintaining heightened readiness. Even after entry, risk had not vanished, it had simply changed form. Another cognitive reset followed. brief but necessary. The risk was restated plainly. Containment was incomplete, and stabilization required sustained authority. This pause ensured focus remained on protection rather than procedure as operations continued. Adjacent access points were sealed to prevent secondary breaches. Internal routes were restricted to essential personnel only, reducing variables within the space. These restrictions were implemented without debate, reflecting lessons learned from earlier hesitation. Documentation continued in parallel, but never at the expense of response speed. Attention then shifted toward immediate prevention of recurrence. Temporary safeguards were introduced to compensate for vulnerabilities exposed during the breach. These measures were designed to function independently of compromised systems, ensuring redundancy until full corrective action could be taken. Authority remained visible throughout the wing. The Royal Guard's presence was not symbolic, it was operational, reinforcing control through consistent oversight and decisive movement. The wing's status was downgraded from restricted to controlled under intervention, reflecting the need for continuous monitoring until safety thresholds were restored. As stabilization progressed, the environment began to normalize. Sensor readings steadied, movement patterns aligned with authorized activity, and internal alerts quieted. Control had been reasserted not through isolation, but through active management. The intervention concluded with reinforced containment rather than withdrawal. The forced entry served as a corrective measure, but its broader impact lay in restoring alignment between safeguards and authority. The incident demonstrated that when systems falter, protection depends on decisive action. The Royal Guard's intervention ensured that control was not merely regained, but secured against further failure.